Hello and welcome to Lead by Example,
the podcast discussing current social justice issues.
Before you listen to this podcast, we just want to give you a quick disclaimer.
We are in no way an authority on these issues.
Our intention is to open healthy discussions without being insensitive.
Due to the length of this podcast, we are aware that we may not cover every intersection of injustice.
However, our aim is to build an understanding of all types of social issues which are intrinsically connected so that they can be better addressed.
We encourage anyone listening to this podcast to take part in the discussions and feel free to ask any questions or suggest topics to us. We hope you enjoy today's podcast.
Just a disclaimer, we've split this episode about white supremacy into two halves because there was just so much to talk about. So this is part one.
Hi guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the book Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad that Lily and I have been working through recently. We think it's a really good starting point for kind of unpacking that internalised racism that you have, and it's a difficult book to work through, but definitely something that you can see the worth of what you're doing.
So the way the book is written, she breaks down different concepts that contribute towards racism, in particular internalised racism. So we're just going to talk about the first section of the book where she really breaks down these different concepts and how they manifest.
So if you haven't read the book, it's split up into 4 different weeks based on the Instagram challenge that she was doing. Okay, so the first week is called The Basics, and the things that she goes over are white privilege, white fragility, tone policing, white silence, white superiority, and white exceptionalism.
So the first one we're going to look at is white privilege. She encouraged us to reflect on what we thought our experiences of white privilege had been and how we had benefited from white privilege.
So white privilege isn't that, it's not that your life is easy, but it's that it isn't made harder by your skin colour, right?
Right. So one of the prompts in the book was, how do you personally benefit from white privilege? So we're going to start by discussing a couple of those points that we'd reflected on. So a big one for me was growing up respecting and trusting in the police system and trusting that they were there to protect me fully and
help you.
And help me if there was an issue.
And almost that lack of awareness, that lack of consideration that maybe they might turn against you or hurt you in any way or anything like that. I find that like tenfold because my dad's a police officer, so I've had that hammered into me that the police are there to serve you and support you and help you, and if something goes wrong you call the police. I think it was only until I kind of got to my teenage years when I realised, when I spoke to my black friends about this, and they would tell me that they didn't like the police, that they were scared of the police, that the police had stopped and searched them multiple times over their life, including in their childhood, where they had basically done nothing wrong. And that for me was a shock, where I was like, but there was almost that lack of belief. Like I didn't want to believe that the police could do that, because I hadn't seen it for myself. So it's that privilege that you hold where that isn't even consideration in your brain.
Right.
And this is from childhood age as well.
Yeah.
Like one of my friends was like 8 years old the first time he got stopped and searched. Like, okay, you look like a bigger guy, but what?
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Another one that I had thought about was being able to go into town and walk into any hairdressers that I like, knowing that they would be able to cut my hair and they wouldn't turn me away for like a hairstyle that I asked for, because they'd all be trained to do my hair.
Yeah, which is crazy because sometimes white privilege manifests in being the default, so knowing that everyone has been trained to deal with you. So obviously hairdressing is a great example, but I find it crazy that hairdressers are trained as default in white hair, but outside of that you have to go to a black hair shop or a black hairdresser, an Afro-Caribbean hairdresser, so that has to be the one that's specified, whereas a hairdresser you naturally assume is white hair, right?
You have to go looking for anything other than white hair. It's about like representation.
Yeah.
And it's not just in hairdressing, and it's in every walk of life. White people are catered to, and black people and people of colour aren't catered to.
Yeah.
And they don't see themselves in the mainstream media as much, and they don't see themselves on advertisements or on billboards or as the protagonist in films and TV shows.
Yeah, and also historically, where you look at performers like musicians, black people were only allowed into the clubs during segregation, where white people were.
To cater to the needs and to entertain white people.
Essentially to serve.
Yeah.
So the only acceptable roles that we see for black people are serving white people. So whether that's a musician, whether that's a performer, whether that's an athlete.
Yeah.
Right.
I haven't had to see people like me targeted.
Yeah.
Like, I haven't grown up constantly seeing in the news people looking like me being called terrorists, people looking like me being killed by the police, people looking like me being wrongly accused of crime. That must like chip away at you as a person, because you don't get this representation in a positive light in other media, and then you get this over-representation in negative media and in news stories, and all of this negative language around people that look like you.
You've never experienced being stereotyped.
Right.
So if someone said to you, oh, white people, there's not that, in mainstream media, there's not that same connotation to white people as a whole. There's not a stereotype of white people. There's white specific groups, like white hooligans, like white old people. But even then, it's not white old people, it's old people. And it's just assumed, like, so there isn't the same. I, as a white person, if I do something, there isn't an assumption that it's based on my race. And if a white person does something, I don't have to answer to that, to what they've done. And also, if I've done something, people don't make assumptions about my entire race based on what I've done.
Hello, so we had to change the angle a bit because one of the phones ran out of storage. So this will be the angle for the rest of the episode.
I don't think you need to have to explain that. Is this okay for you? It's okay for me.
I think we were just about to talk about white fragility.
Okay.
So she gives a really good quote at the beginning of this section, just like a basic definition of what white fragility is, which she credits to Robin DiAngelo. And so they define it as a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves.
And also, I think it's important to note that Robin DiAngelo also said that it's white people's responsibility to be less fragile. People of colour don't need to twist themselves into knots trying to navigate us as painlessly as possible. So I think it's important for white people to remember that it's not down to black people or people of colour to explain it to us and
to educate us,
tiptoe around us and spoon feed us carefully. It's down to us to be less fragile to that.
Right.
If we had more experience of these conversations when we were younger, we would be more comfortable with talking about stuff like that. And in general, not even just about race, but there are a lot of conversations that if you have while you're young, it's a lot more comfortable to have when you're older.
For example, when I first started entering into the conversation about race, started opening my mind to it and joining in the conversation a bit more, I felt like I was being personally shamed for all of these issues that happen in society. So I had like a big feeling of guilt. She talks about white fragility showing up in crying and in like over empathy almost, and shock and outrage, and how actually that's not very helpful, because continually showing how shocked and outraged you are at these things every time they happen just kind of highlights the fact that it hasn't happened to you that much and that you haven't had to experience that, and that that's actually quite upsetting for black people and people of colour to be consistently reminded that you as a white person has had the privilege of not having to experience all of these things.
And also it's not helpful.
Right, and it stops you from making the next step forward and making progress and initiating change if you're wrapped up in a feeling of guilt and shame and upset. It's not constructive.
I think that Layla says at some point in this book, those emotions are not useful, but anger you can use. So you can be angry about this stuff because that can be that fuel to push you forward and create change. But these other emotions, they're useless, so forget leave them alone. Leave them to the back.
Feel them and then put them
go.
aside. Yeah. Feel them, put them aside, and use them in a positive way. Which I guess is what we're trying to do with this, is we see these problems, we have these feelings, and we're trying to make a next step and engage people and contribute what little we can to initiating these discussions and starting a conversation, which hopefully people will find helpful.
Yeah. And also we want to just reiterate that it's okay to feel those things.
Right.
We might be discussing it and saying they're not useful, but it's okay to feel them.
It's the first step in making the change, because if you haven't felt any of this guilt, shame, upset, outrage, you're not going to be motivated to change what's happened and what the system is. So they're important to have as a first step, but it's also important to know that you need to get out of that first initial step, and that there are ways that you can do that, and there are constructive, helpful ways that you could do that. For me personally, white fragility has shown itself in running away from not physically running away, but running away from conversations that were happening about race, which I would always say, oh, I don't have anything to contribute to this, or I don't know enough about it, so I can't talk about it. Which then leads to white silence. Yes.
I think that can lead to, if you're running away from conversations, number one, it can lead to white silence. So actually being non-vocal about stuff, which doesn't help anyone. In fact, it does the opposite. But also sometimes when those conversations do come up, especially with black people, you end up trying to almost reason with them and explain yourself out of why you haven't been involved in these conversations before, and then it kind of leads into white exceptionalism, where you're saying, oh, but I care, like I'm not racist.
You look for all of the things positive that you do, and you put to the side, or you don't even try to think about what you might not be doing,
and you use those as
you
excuses.
ignore.
You use all those things that you do as excuses for why you don't have to be involved in that conversation. So one of the prompts, she says, how do you feel when you hear the words white people? Do they make you feel uncomfortable? So I, in the past, have definitely felt uncomfortable with that, and probably thought that people talking about white people was racist, especially when they were kind of talking about stereotypes or generalizations.
So she talks about how, as a white person, yes, you can experience prejudice, and no one is telling you that you've never experienced people judging you for the colour of your skin, but actually that's where it stops. And racism is much deeper than that, because racism is backed up by a system of power and oppression and the history of it all. So prejudice against white people is, generally speaking, one person having prejudice against one other person, and yes, it's not nice, and yes, it's bad, but that person can go home that day and not worry about their entire lives being a reflection of that person's opinions.
Yeah, whereas racism is an entire system set up against a whole group of people based on their skin colour. Sorry, can I just say, off the back of that definition of racism, I just want to make it clear that that is why people cannot be racist towards white people.
Right.
So yes, you can be prejudiced towards white people, but you cannot be racist towards white people, and the power is the thing that makes the difference.
Right. So tone policing, if you haven't heard that term before.
Tone policing is basically where you're having a conversation with an individual or a group of people who have been oppressed, and rather than listening to them in the way that they choose to present their conversation or their narrative, you focus on the way that it's being presented by them, and you tell them that you're not going to listen based on the way that they are telling you this information, essentially putting yourself back into the position of power and not being vulnerable in that situation, and not essentially listening to what they're saying, focusing rather on the manner that they're saying it in. I mean, I could give an example of the recent Black Lives Matter protests and people saying, oh, I agree with the message, but I don't think that violence is necessary. Where people should actually be saying, violence isn't necessary, but I fully agree with the message that is being communicated and the reason why they have to do this. So tone policing would be focusing on the fact that there's violence. A small percentage of the protests have manifested in violence.
And I would like to add as well that it's predominantly white people tone policing black people and people of colour. White people can tone police each other, but the issue that we're trying to discuss is when white people actively tone police black people and people of colour.
I think it is actually worth thinking as a white person that it's important to sometimes tone police yourself when you are talking to other white people, whether that's your friends or your family, because this is a message that they need to hear.
Hi, we ran out of time to film the other day, so we're now here.
Continuing the conversation. Cool. All right. So I was the sentence that I was in the middle of saying last time was, in terms of tone policing, it can be different depending on who you're talking to. So it's important not to tone police black people or people of colour when they're explaining things to you, or when you're having a conversation with them about their experiences. However, when it comes to your conversations with your family as a white person, or families or friends, it can be limiting to the message if you don't tone police yourself.
It affects the effectiveness of
Yeah.
the message. An example of a phrase that someone might say that is tone policing is something like, oh, I hear what you're saying, but the language you're using is too aggressive. It's making me feel attacked. It's making me feel ashamed. So can you phrase it a different way? Or something like that.
Or just diminishing someone's message because saying, oh, I understand what she was saying, but she just comes across as angry, or she was just very angry about it.
Yeah, so I've had times where I've chosen to avoid someone's social media page for no reason other than I felt it was a bit it felt aggressive, and so I was like, okay, I'll avoid that. And then looking back on that now, I'm like, that is what I was doing. I was tone policing them because they were sharing their experiences and sharing their emotions and their anger, and I was like, I don't want to listen to what you're saying because it's making me uncomfortable. So I just pushed it to the side.
I had the exact same situation with Instagram, and the other day I read a post that made me feel uncomfortable, and I actively had to stop myself from unfollowing that person. Right. Because I was like, oh wow, this I had to almost acknowledge the reason why it made me feel that way, and it was because I was so used to white centering, where I'm putting my feelings before oppressed people, and because she was not venting, but she was just expressing how she felt and about years of being oppressed by white people, and she wasn't making any excuse for white people, she wasn't catering to them,
right?
That I was like, oh, she hasn't said anything nice about white people in this post, everything's been angry. And so
and I still definitely not like actively look for it, but when I'm watching things like that on social media, it's like I'm like anticipating it. I'm waiting for someone to be like, oh, but we're really grateful for all of like the stuff that other people are doing. I'm like, why am I waiting for that? Why am I expecting to be, I guess, affirmed by someone? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, like you want to be thanked when people are angry at white people for oppressing them, and I'm waiting for them to say, but there are some white people who are good. So why do I have the need to hear that? Like, I need to be told that it's not me. Like, I haven't...
Right. And that kind of crosses over with white exceptionalism,
right,
which we're going to talk about in a sec. That is, like, you're searching for a way out. You're searching for a... excuse to be like, oh, they're saying that, but it's not about me directly. Like,
I don't have to be involved, like included.
I don't have to feel bad about what she's saying there because I'm not. That's not me.
Yeah.
When I first started entering into conversations about race, gender, sexual orientation, all sorts, the more aggressive or more passionate accounts of experiences that people had kind of initiated my fight or flight reflex instinct, because it felt almost like a personal attack, which I think is part of the big issue that people feel with trying to engage others in these conversations. Is it's so hard to phrase things in a way that is almost like coddling people so that they aren't offended at all by what you're saying. And the level of comfort doesn't necessarily decrease. You just get used to it more, and you choose to put yourself in those uncomfortable situations for the greater good, I guess, like for the benefit of you and the people around you. Yeah, and that feeling of almost being targeted or something's directed personally to you is, I think, a very big misconception about advocacy. In general, because if people are advocates, they're going to be passionate about something, and they're going to speak passionately, as with people who are passionate about teaching or people who are passionate about science. Everyone speaks in a certain manner when they're passionate about something. It's actually about connecting yourself with the greater message that people are trying to put across, rather than spiraling into this person's attacking me, so I'm going to ignore what they're saying.
I think if you're watching this podcast, you have probably made a conscious effort to learn, which means that you're already one step on your journey towards making a conscious effort to overcome those instincts and reflexes that have been instilled in you. So tone policing is something that we're naturally, as white people, we have learned, and it's something that we have to consciously unlearn.
All of these topics and terms are something that we're probably going to be using quite a lot of in future episodes about race, so this is where to find them if you want them.
There's a little glossary of all the terms.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for listening to part 1.
For now, we want to leave you with some of our recommendations on this topic.
First of all, we want to highlight the book that we've been discussing, which is called Me and White Supremacy, written by Layla Saad.
Secondly, the book Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, written by Rennie Edo-Lodge. It is a good breakdown into systemic racism in the UK. She openly gives her personal accounts of growing up black in the UK and provides a good foundation of information on all race issues.
Akala is a British activist, author and rapper who openly contributes much of his time to engaging in conversations about race. His book, Natives, Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire, dives a little deeper into the root causes of racism in the UK.
Noughts and Crosses is a TV show available to watch on BBC iPlayer that is a dramatised adaptation of the books by the same name, written by Mallory Blackman. The show is set in an alternate universe in which white people are the oppressed and black people are the elite in society.
Finally, Dear White People is a Netflix comedy drama surrounding race relations in America at a university.
We will include more information about these recommendations and where to find them, as well as any others that we think would be useful on this topic in the description box.
Thanks again for listening and stay tuned for part 2.